Thank you. Toby, you are British, country and Israeli, a country which had supported the concept of the State of Israel with Lord Balfour. You had pros and cons. The history of the relationship between UK and Israel has been up and down. What is the present situation? Do you have the same problems that we have in the western side of Europe with an important Muslim minority and extreme right and the same distorted image of Israel?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the specific history of Britain and its relationship with Israel and its role here in the region. It's worth remembering that we're talking about the image of Israel across Europe, but of course every European country has its own distinct political culture, its own history, its own geopolitical situation which affects how it approaches these issues, and that's certainly true for Britain, though I think of course there are common trends which cross European countries. I think in Britain there are a lot of positives to point to. Some of them have been alluded to already. The trade relationship, for example, between Britain and Israel is growing. Trade is an important part of British foreign policy, particularly at the moment in the current economic climate. And Britain looks at Israel and sees an opportunity. And trade has grown year on year over recent years. A lot of intense focus, for example, by the UK on how to harness the strength of Israel's high-tech sector, how to build synergy between British companies and investors and Israeli high-tech. And so we see a lot of positives in that arena. And there are other areas where there's strong cooperation and commonality of views. In the strategic arena, looking at the region, there is a lot of commonality between Israel's concerns and Britain's concerns. If we think, for example, particularly about Iran, over the course of recent years, although there are ups and downs and some differences of opinion perhaps now since the election of President Rouhani in Iran, generally speaking over the last few years, if you talk to both Israeli officials and British officials, you'll find a degree of satisfaction each with the other's position and a lot of cooperation on that issue, and on other regional threats of extremism also. And in terms of Israel's legitimacy, in the UK there is still a bedrock consensus across the political spectrum in the UK that it's still crossing the line to call into question Israel's legitimacy and Israel's right to exist, and politicians that have crossed that line over the last 12 or 18 months have found themselves isolated. But there is a threat to that consensus, and there are small but vocal groups of ideological groups that are fundamentally opposed to Israel's existence, and that's regardless of what Israel does. It's a root ideological opposition to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, and their narrative of Israel as an apartheid state has penetrated to some extent and spread into the mainstream, and there is a threat of that.
Especially in universities, if I understand.
In universities, promoted by some left-wing trade unions and other organizations, and that is a threat, and to some extent it's a failure also of the centre ground, not being informed and not pushing back, and that's something that BICOM is working on very much, trying to provide high-quality information, analysis about what's going on here to undermine the wave of falsehoods about Israel, and that's an important part of it. But there are the most decisive elements which affect how Israel is perceived, both at the political level and at the level of public opinion in the UK. We can really point to one headline issue, which is the peace process. Ultimately, when people in the UK, and I think this is probably true elsewhere in Europe as well, perceive Israel to be serious about the peace process, to perceive Israel to be committed to the two-state solution, and to be prepared to make compromises for peace, then those ideological opponents who oppose the existence of the State of Israel have a much tougher time spreading their views into the mainstream. There is much less appetite for those views to spread. If people don't perceive Israel to be serious about the peace process, then that is when we have trouble with those that are ideologically opposed to Israel having much more fertile ground to work with. Now, at the moment, we have an active peace process, which is a much better situation than we had until quite recently. But we still have a problem because there is a lack of faith in that peace process. There is a lack of optimism in that peace process. And also there is a growing fear, a growing concern, and a growing idea that we are somehow approaching a point where the two-state solution will no longer be possible. And we hear this from the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, who's by no means an enemy of Israel or an anti-Zionist, saying, you know, we're running out of time for a two-state solution. And you hear this also from John Kerry and many others around the world. And this is very, from Ashton as well, quite possibly. Israel's legitimacy, I think, in the UK, certainly in the UK, and I imagine across Europe, is very much tied to the perception that Israel is committed to the creation of a Palestinian state and the two-state solution. So the idea that the window is closing for that possibility, I think, is a very significant threat. So it's very important that Israel continues to do what it can to make a convincing case that it is serious about the peace process, that it is serious about the two-state solution. There are other factors as well. I would say the secondary factor is Israel, and we can show this through polling that BICOM has done over many years, as well as just anecdotal experience. After the peace process, the next most impactful thing that Israel can do to improve its image is to convince people, show people that Israel is a genuine liberal democracy. And that, when people see that and believe that, they feel then the image of Israel is stronger. And so, for example, when we had in the last Knesset legislation introduced to the Knesset, which was criticized very much inside Israel as being anti-democratic or anti-liberal, that made a lot of waves, a lot of headlines, certainly in the UK, and did no favors whatsoever for Israel's image as a liberal democracy. So really, I think, to improve Israel's image, we need to confront head-on those that are opposed to Israel's existence and highlight that, show them for what they are, which is they're opponents of the peace process and they are opponents of the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination. We have to show them for what they are. At the same time, Israel needs to do what it can to make a convincing case that it is serious about the peace process and that it is a robust liberal democracy.
Of course, it's very important, but also, I must say, I'm rather surprised to see that Europeans are taking care of the subject of labeling Israeli products when at the same time there is 120,000 people killed in a country like Syria, as if it was as important to take care of the labeling of some agricultural product than seeing so many deaths.
Roger, just let's say the word anti-Semitism, because we talk about everything, but we don't talk about the most important, that anti-Semitism. There is in Europe, and particularly in France, we have a part of the population who is very active against Jewish people.
That's right. Maurice?
Yes, Elie is right, and what has been said so far is extremely right. In fact, what's happening, if you look at the situation in a lot of countries, and France is one of the examples, but there are a lot of other countries, you see that this anti-Semitism issue, which was buried because of the consequence of the World War II and what happened with the Nazis, etc. Everyone has been extremely quiet. But since roughly 20 years, we see a small resurgence and we see some rampant anti-Semitism, and sometimes it's not only rampant, it is something which is quite strong. There is another element which is also extremely important, and if we want to understand what's going on with the government, we have to bear in mind that the new generation of immigrants coming from North Africa, coming from Pakistan, and all the 10 in England, in Europe, it's starting to vote and it's starting to represent a power which is, if you look at France, 10 times the Jews. And politicians are taking care of this. But what is the most important aspect among all this is that how can we regain the opinion, the public opinion in favor of Israel? If you look at this geopolitical situation, we will always have enemies. We will always have anti-Semitic reactions. Look at what happened with Durban. Durban has been a shame for the world, and the world has let it happen. You will have very little voices who have been able to say something about what was going on Durban. Ahmadinejad could say at the United Nations that he wanted the destruction of the state of Israel, and the reaction has been very mild. Why that? And I think that we have to think about this. I think that the most important aspect is that in the mind of the public opinion, Israel has lost the moral ground. And that is probably the most important issue. Extreme left, as well as extreme right, but extreme right, we are used to this. The fascist has been always against the Jews. So we could expect that at least the leftists and the extreme left would be in favor of the Jews. The Greens are against, and they are anti-Semitic. The socialists are against the way the Arabs and Islamists have won a position within the Socialist Party all over Europe, simply because Palestinians are seen as victims and Israel is seen as people occupying their territories and not allowing these people to live freely with their own boundaries, is something which is creating a huge problem. That's the reason why I agree with you. We have to come and to be extremely serious about the two states, otherwise it will be one state, and we don't know what that one state will be. So this is something which is absolutely critical. The last thing that I would like to point out is something that we should not be naive about, that a lot of people around the world believe that we are responsible for the terror. We are responsible for the terror because as long as Israel exists, and this is the very existence of the state of Israel, we will see people who will be doing 9/11, terrorist attack, and a lot of things, and they will claim that this is because of the injustice which is done toward the Palestinians. And this is totally unfair, it is unjust, and there is a lot of politicians who believe this, starting with Obama. And Obama is a little bit naive about what's going on in the region, and he has not taken the right steps. And if you listen to the speech of Obama when he went to the University of Cairo, I'm still having a very, I would say, a goosebump about this, because it was frightening. He was buying totally what the Arab propaganda was saying about Israel and the position of the state of Israel. So we need absolutely to regain the moral ground. We need absolutely to have a position which is extremely strong about our moral values, about ethics. And it's not only the fact that we have some very clever young guys who are doing startups, which is extremely good, and particularly for the business and for a lot of things, and for the image of the fact that we have some very bright people. It's not enough. We have to regain the support of the intellectuals around the world in order that they claim that Israel is indispensable for the peace in the region. Israel and its democracy is indispensable for the region, and that we have to support it. The first thing that we have to do is to regain the support of the intellectuals that we lost in the 70s. And to do that, we have to work hard.